I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office, finishing up the bank statement and wondering if the price of beer was going to go up again in 1951 when the doorbell rang. Normally, a ring at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday means a delivery or a salesman who hasn't heard that Nero Wolfe doesn't buy anything at the door. But this ring had a certain persistence to it. Not a frantic jiggle, but a steady, rhythmic demand that suggested the person on the other side had checked their watch and decided we were late for them. I glanced at the monitor. Wolfe was up in the plant rooms with Theodore, probably telling a Catlier it wasn't trying hard enough. He wouldn't be down until 4 o'clock sharp, and it was currently 3:54. I went to the front door, slipped the chain and opened it. Standing there was a man who looked like he'd been assembled from expensive but slightly mismatched parts. He wore a Chesterfield coat that cost more than my car, a Homburg perched at an angle that suggested he owned a sidewalk, and an expression that said he'd just smelled something vaguely unpleasant, likely the fact that I hadn't opened the door 10 seconds sooner. "Nero Wolfe?" he snapped. "I'm Archie Goodwin," I told him, keeping my tone as smooth as glass. "Mr. Wolfe is with his orchids. He doesn't exist for the outside world until 4. You can come in and wait, or you can stand on the step and practice your scowl. It's a nice scowl, but it won't move the clock." He didn't like that, which was a point in his favor. He stepped inside, smelling of high-end bay rum and old money. I took his coat and hat, led him into the office and offered him the red leather chair. He sat on the edge of it, looking around the room as if he were evaluating the wood paneling for a demolition bid. "My name is Sterling Vane," he said, as if I should have already started typing the receipt. I was told Wolfe is the only man in New York with enough arrogance to handle this. "He's got plenty of that," I agreed, sitting behind my desk. "But he usually likes to know what this is before he starts charging for arrogance. Is it a kidnapping, a corporate raid, or did someone lose a stamp collection?" Vane leaned forward, his knuckles white against the mahogany of his walking stick. "It is a matter of intellectual property, Mr. Goodwin, and a matter of a dead man's reputation. My father, Marcus Vane, died 2 weeks ago. He was the chairman of Varney Logistics. Since his passing, a specific set of architectural blueprints, plans for a revolutionary shipping hub in Jersey, have vanished. If they end up in the hands of the Continental Syndicate, my father's legacy isn't just tarnished, it's liquidated." I cocked an eyebrow. "Missing papers. Sounds like a job for a filing clerk, not a private detective who hates leaving his house. There were 5 people in the study the night they vanished," Vane said, his voice dropping an octave. "All family, all board members. And this morning I received a note. No ransom demand. Just a quote from the Roman poet Horace. 'Pale death kicks at the houses of the poor and the towers of the kings with an equal foot.' It was hidden inside my morning paper. Inside my house, the elevator groaned in the hallway. That meant the clock had struck 4 and the king was descending. Nero Wolfe entered the room, a one-man parade of yellow silk and disgruntled genius. He didn't look at Vane. He didn't look at me. He walked straight to his desk, adjusted the blotter by a 1/16 of an inch, and sat. The chair complained, as it always does, but it held. Wolfe sighed, a sound like a tire losing air, and finally leveled his gaze at our visitor. "Mr. Vane," Wolfe said, his voice clipped, "you are vibrating. It is distracting. If you are here to ask me to find a thief, you are wasting your time and mine. I do not chase shadows." Vane stood up, his face flushing. "I'm not asking you to chase them, Mr. Wolfe. I'm telling you they are already in your neighborhood. The man who sent that note knows you. He mentioned your name in a second message I found in my car on the way here." Vane reached into his pocket and pulled out a small square slip of paper. He laid it on Wolfe's desk. Wolfe didn't touch it. He leaned back, his chin sinking into his chest, his eyes narrowed to slits. I stood up, walked over, and read it aloud for the record. "Wolfe will see the patterns, but even he cannot stop the clock. The year ends, and so does the Varney dynasty. Ask him about the 1928 vintage." Wolfe's eyes snapped open. For a second, just a second, the boredom vanished, replaced by a cold, hard light I'd only seen a few times before. He didn't care about the blueprints. He didn't mind Vane's fortune, but someone had just entered his kitchen and poked the chef. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Yeah, blossoms. Check the wine cellar. The 1928 Montrachet, the third bottle from the left in the second rack. I didn't argue. I went. I took the stairs to the basement 2 at a time, grabbed the flashlight and swung open the heavy door to the cellar. I found the rack. I found the bottle. I also found the small black velvet ribbon tied around its neck, a ribbon that hadn't been there yesterday. Attached to the ribbon was a tiny silver key. I went back upstairs and set the key on Wolfe's desk. The silence in the office was so thick you could have sliced it with a paring knife. Wolfe looked at the key, then at Vane, then at me. His face was a mask of granite, but I saw the way his fingers twitched against the arms of his chair. Someone had breached the brownstone. Someone had bypassed our locks, my ears, and the sanctity of Wolfe's sanctuary. "Mr. Vane," Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble, "you mentioned 5 suspects. You will have them all here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Archie, give Mr. Vane a drink. He's going to need it. And then get your notebook. We are no longer discussing blueprints. We are discussing a trespass." Vane looked relieved, but I wasn't. When Wolfe gets that tone, it means he's stopped being a detective and started being a hunter. And usually, I'm the one who has to do the running. The following morning, the atmosphere in the brownstone was about as cozy as a morgue's waiting room. Wolfe had spent his breakfast hour in a state of suspended animation, which for him meant consuming his eggs au beurre noir with a focused intensity that suggested the butter had personally offended him. He hadn't said a word about the silver key or the velvet ribbon. When he finally went up to the plant rooms at 9, he didn't even give me the usual instructions about the mail. He just turned his back, entered the elevator, and vanished upward, leaving me to deal with the inevitable arrival of the Varney entourage. By 10:45, the front room felt like a pressure cooker. Fritz was in the kitchen, making a heroic effort to ignore the fact that the house had been violated, while I stood by the door, playing doorman for a group of people who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Sterling Vane had followed orders, though I suspected it took every ounce of his blue-blooded willpower to assemble the suspects and march them onto our turf. First through the door was Eleanor Vane, Sterling's stepmother, and the widow of the late Marcus. She was 40-ish, dressed in a black suit that cost enough to feed a mid-sized suburb, and possessed a gaze that could peel paint. She didn't walk into the hallway, she occupied it. Behind her came Arthur Vance, the family lawyer, who looked exactly like a man who spent his life reading fine print, dry, grey, and perpetually worried about the carpet. Then there were the cousins, Julian and Beatrice, who seemed to share a common trait of looking bored to hide the fact that they were terrified. I ushered them into the office. The room is big, but with 5 people sitting in a semicircle facing Wolfe's empty desk, it started to feel cramped. I took my place at my desk, opened the notebook, and waited. The silver key was still sitting on the blotter, catching the light from the window. It acted like a magnet. Every one of them glanced at it, then quickly looked away, as if it might bite. "Where is he?" Eleanor Vane demanded, her voice sharp. She didn't sit in the red leather chair, she took one of the smaller ones, perched on the edge as if ready to bolt. Sterling said this was urgent. "I have a board meeting at noon. Mr. Wolfe is with his orchids, Mrs. Vane," I said, leaning back. "In this house, the orchids come before board meetings, the police, and occasionally the law of gravity. He'll be down at 11. In the meantime, I'm Archie Goodwin. I'm the one who does the legwork, so if you want to start confessing now, it'll save us all a lot of breath." Julian Vane, a young man with a haircut that screamed Ivy League and a nervous habit of tapping his signet ring against his knee, let out a short, jagged laugh. Confessing to what? Being related to a man who couldn't keep track of his own files? My uncle was brilliant, but toward the end, he was seeing ghosts in the machinery. Those blueprints could be anywhere. "They aren't anywhere," Sterling snapped from his position by the window. "They were stolen, and someone is using this house to mock us." The room went silent as the elevator hummed in the distance. The sound of the doors opening and the heavy rhythmic tread of Wolfe's footsteps followed. When he entered Chich E-room, he didn't offer a greeting. He walked to his chair, sat, and spent a solid minute adjusting himself until the center of the universe was properly aligned. He looked at the 5 faces before him, his yellow gold eyes moving slowly, weighing each of them like a butcher eyeing a side of beef. "Yesterday," Wolfe began, his voice a low, resonant rumble, "a silver key was placed in my wine cellar. It was accompanied by a note that suggested my own involvement in your family's squabbles. I do not like being suggested. I particularly do not like my cellar being used as a post office for anonymous provocateurs. Arthur Vance, the lawyer, cleared his throat. Mr. Wolfe, with all due respect, we are here because Sterling insisted. But the matter of the blueprints is a private corporate concern. This intrusion in your home is likely a coincidence. A prank, perhaps, by a disgruntled employee. Wolfe turned his head an inch toward Vance. A prank to enter a locked brownstone, navigate a basement, and identify a specific vintage of Montrachet requires intent, not whimsy. It requires knowing my habits and my home. One of you provided that knowledge. That's an outrageous accusation, Beatrice Vane said, her voice trembling slightly. She was the youngest, barely 24, with large, watery eyes. None of us have ever been here before. Physical presence is not a requirement for betrayal, Wolfe remarked. He picked up the silver key, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. This key fits a lock. I do not know which lock, but whoever put it here knows I will find it. They are inviting me to play a game. I find games tedious, unless I am the one setting the rules. He leaned forward, his bulk casting a shadow over the desk. You were all in Marcus Vane's study the night the blueprints vanished. You all had a motive to see the logistics project fail, or to sell the lands to the syndicate. Money is the usual lubricant for such actions. But this note, this reference to Horace and the vintage of 1928, suggests something more than greed. It suggests a grudge, a deep, fermented resentment. Eleanor Vane rose, her face pale. I've heard enough. If you're going to sit there and insult us while my husband isn't even cold in the ground— Sit down, madame, Wolfe snapped. The command was so sharp she actually sat back down before she realized she'd done it. You are here because I have decided you are here. If you leave, I shall be forced to involve Inspector Cramer of the 5-0, and I assure you, his methods are far less civil than my silence. Now, Archie— Yes, sir, Mr. Vane's car is outside. You will accompany these people back to the Vane estate. You will observe. You will not look for blueprints. You will look for the lock that fits this key. And you will look for the person who is currently feeling the most satisfied with themselves. Satisfaction is a difficult emotion to hide for long. I stood up, grabbing my hat. The suspects looked at me like I was a plague carrier. Sterling Vane looked at Wolfe, his expression a mix of awe and irritation. He had wanted a detective, and he'd ended up with a dictator. One more thing, Wolfe added as we moved toward the door. The note mentioned the end of the year. We have 3 days. I do not intend to spend New Year's Eve wondering why a stranger has the run of my basement. Archie, do not return without a name. I led the group into the cold December air. As I pulled the heavy front door shut, I looked back at Wolfe. He was already reaching for the button to summon Fritz for a beer. He looked perfectly composed, but I knew better. The sanctity of the brownstone had been poked, and Nero Wolfe was about to make someone regret they were ever born. I followed the Vanes to the curb, thinking a boo. That silver key. It was small, delicate, and looked like it belonged to a jewelry box or a private diary. Not exactly the kind of thing you'd use to secure a shipping empire, but exactly the kind of thing you'd use to break a man's heart. As I climbed into the lead car next to Sterling, the city felt tighter than usual. The grey slush on the streets reflected a sky that was getting ready to dump another few inches of winter on us. I had 3 days to find a lock, a thief, and a reason why someone thought they could play tag in Nero Wolfe's cellar. The hunt was on, and I had a feeling the Vane estate was going to be even colder than the sidewalk. The Vane estate was a limestone fortress on East 72nd Street that managed to look both arrogant and exhausted. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the kind of quiet that usually follows a reading of a will. I followed the quintet into a drawing room that featured enough velvet to upholster a fleet of ocean liners. Sterling Vane took his post by the fireplace, looking like he wanted to punch the mantel, while the others distributed themselves across the furniture with the practiced ease of people who had spent their lives being served. I stood by the door, keeping my coat on. It's a tactical choice. It reminds people you aren't staying for tea, and that you're prepared to chase them if they bolt. All right, I said, breaking the silence that was getting heavy enough to crack the floorboards. Mr. Wolfe wants a name, but I'll settle for a map. You were all here the night the blueprints went for a walk. I want to know exactly where everyone was sitting, what you were drinking, and who stepped out to use the powder room or check the weather. And let's try to minimize the lies. It saves time, and I'm on the clock." Eleanor Vane arched a perfectly groomed eyebrow. "Mr. Goodwin, this is absurd. We have already spoken to the police. They found nothing. No forced entry, no suspicious prints. If you think your presence here will magically produce a confession, you're as delusional as your employer. The police look for fingerprints, Mrs. Vane. I look for the way people twitch when they're uncomfortable," I told her. "For instance, Julian over there hasn't stopped adjusting his tie since we left 35th Street, and Beatrice looks like she's about to burst into tears or a song, and I'm betting on the tears. Now, let's start with the lawyer. Mr. Vance, you were handling the documents that night. Where were they?" Arthur Vance cleared his throat, the sound like dry leaves skittering on a sidewalk. "They were in the mahogany humidor on Marcus's desk. It's a reinforced box with a dual-key system. Marcus held one key, I held the other. We had just finished a preliminary review of the Jersey Hub expansion. The board, those present here, were in agreement on the terms. I placed the folders inside, locked it, and we moved to the dining room for a late supper. When we returned an hour later to retrieve my copies, the humidor was open, empty. "And the keys?" I asked. "In our pockets," Sterling barked. "I checked my father's myself. It hadn't been touched, and Vance claims he was with him the entire time. No one entered the study during dinner. The maid was in the pantry, and the butler was serving us." I turned to Julian. "You're the nephew, the one who thinks his uncle was seeing ghosts. What's your stake in the Jersey Hub? I hear the syndicate would pay a pretty penny to make sure those docks never get built." Julian's face went a shade of red that didn't match his tie. "I'm a Vane. I don't sell out my family for syndicate scrap. I disagreed with the location of the hub, sure. It's built on marshland that'll be underwater in 20 years. I said it was a vanity project. That doesn't make me a thief. It makes you a critic," I countered. "And critics often like to prove they're right by making sure the project fails. How about you, Beatrice? You've been very quiet. Your father left you a significant share of the company, but only if the hub project was completed. If it fails, your inheritance stays in trust until you're 30. That's 6 years of waiting. Unless, of course, you had enough cash now to disappear." Beatrice didn't cry. She just looked at me with a coldness that surprised me. "I loved my father, Mr. Goodwin, but I hate this house. Everyone here is waiting for someone else to die or stumble. If I took those papers, it wouldn't be for the money. It would be to burn them so we could all finally stop talking about logistics and start living." That was the first honest thing I'd heard all morning. It was also the most dangerous. People who want to burn it all down are usually the ones who leave the most matches lying around. I spent the next hour wandering the room, poking at the edges of their stories. It was a classic setup: 5 people, 1 locked box, and a vacuum where the truth should be. But there was a missing piece. Wolfe hadn't sent me here for the blueprints, he'd sent me for the lock. I pulled the silver key from my pocket, letting it dangle from my fingers. "Does this look familiar to anyone?" I asked, circling the room. A little silver key with a scrollwork design on the bow. "It was left in Mr. Wolfe's cellar as a souvenir. It's not for a mahogany humidor. It's for something smaller, something personal." The reaction was a symphony of blank stares, except for Eleanor. She didn't stare, she blinked. Just once, a quick shutter movement of the eyelids. It was enough. "Mrs. Vane?" I prompted. "It looks like a common trinket," she said, her voice steady. "The kind of thing one finds on a charm bracelet or a Victorian tea caddy. Ain't seen it before." "Funny," I said, "because when I showed it, you looked at that desk in the corner, the one with the roll top." "That was my husband's private desk," she said, her voice rising. "It hasn't been opened since the funeral. The executors have the keys." "Then they won't mind if I try this one," I said, stepping toward the desk. "You will do no such thing." Sterling stepped in my path, his face inches from mine. "This is a private residence, Goodwin. You've had your fun. If Wolfe wants to play riddles, he can do it on his own time. Get out." I looked at him, then at the others. They were unified now, a solid wall of family pride and hidden agendas. I could have pushed it, but I'd seen what I needed to see. The silver key was the spark, and the Varney family was the tinder. I smiled, tucked the key back into my pocket, and tipped my hat. "I'll let myself out," I said. But a word of advice for the new year: when Mr. Wolfe sends a key, he already knows what's behind the door. He's just waiting to see if you'll open it for him, or if he has to kick it down. I'd start thinking about which way you want the hinges to swing. I walked out of the limestone fortress and back into the New York slush. I didn't have the blueprints, but I had something better. I had a reaction from the widow, and a room full of people who were terrified of a tiny piece of silver. As I hailed a cab, I thought about the Horace quote, "Pale death kicks at the towers of kings." The Vanes were definitely in a tower, and I could hear the kicking starting. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office, nursing a glass of beer and staring at a map of the New Jersey coastline. He didn't look up when I came in. "Well," he grunted. "The widow knows the key," I said, sitting at my desk. "And the nephew thinks the project is a swamp. The lawyer is too dry to be human, and the daughter wan. TS to burn the house down. Also, Sterling Vane has a very expensive temper. We're right on schedule." Wolfe grunted again, but this time it sounded almost like a purr. "The 1928 vintage, Archie. It wasn't just wine. It was a message about a specific year of failure. We aren't looking for a thief. We are looking for a ghost who has decided to settle an old debt." By the time the clock on the mantel chimed 2, I was back out in the elements. The elements is a polite word for the grey, freezing soup that New York calls December. Wolfe had spent the intervening hour in a state of tectonic rumination, which meant he sat perfectly still while his brain rearranged the universe. He had tossed me a bone before I left, the year 1928. It wasn't just the vintage of the wine, it was the year Marcus Vane had first made his mark on the city's skyline, and apparently the year someone else had been erased from it. My job was to find out who had been holding a grudge for 23 years and why they'd waited until now to start poking at the master of West 35th Street. I started at the Gazette. Lon Cohen is the only man in Manhattan who knows more secrets than a priest and has fewer scruples about sharing them, provided you bring him something in return. I brought him the promise of an exclusive if and when Wolfe cracked the Vane case, and a corned beef sandwich from the deli downstairs that was thick enough to use as a doorstop. Lon leaned back in his chair, ignoring the chaos of the newsroom around him, and chewed thoughtfully. 1928, Archie? That's ancient history, Lon said, wiping mustard from his lip. The Vanes were untouchable back then. Marcus was the boy wonder of the docks. He bought up the Jersey waterfront while everyone else was busy losing their shirts in the market. But there was a partner, a man named Silas Thorne. They were the VNT of Varney and Thorne Logist. ICS until the partnership dissolved in a pile of litigation and bad blood. Thorne claimed Marcus squeezed him out of the Jersey hub plans, the original ones, and framed him for a series of kickbacks. Thorne went to Sing Sing for 3 years. Marcus went to the Waldorf. "And what happened to Thorne?" I asked, leaning against the filing cabinet. "He died in a tenement fire in 42, Lon said, shrugging. "At least that's what records say. But Thorne had a son, a kid who'd have been about 20 when his old man went up in smoke. If you're looking for a ghost with a grievance, that's your pedigree. But Archie, that doesn't explain how someone got into your house. That takes more than a grudge. It takes a blueprint of the brownstone." I thanked Lon and went back to the street, feeling the chill sink into my marrow. I spent the next 4 hours doing the kind of pavement pounding that makes me wish I'd stayed in Ohio and taken up farming. I checked with the locksmiths who handle the high-end residential accounts, the old building department records for the Vane estate, and a few of my more questionable contacts in the unauthorized entry business. By 5 o'clock, I was at a small, cramped shop in the village that smelled of oil and burnt metal. The man behind the counter, a fellow named Salty who could pick a lock with a toothpick, looked at the sketch ID made of the silver key. "It's a specialty job, Archie," Salty wheezed, squinting through a jeweler's loop, old French style, maybe late 19th century. "The scrollwork on the bow is a signature. A guy named Renault used to make these for personal safes and jewelry boxes for the carriage trade. There are not many left. They're beautiful, but they're a headache. The tumblers are set like a musical scale. You don't pick 'em, you play 'em. Who owns one now?" I asked. "One went through an auction at Sotheby's 3 Mont. "HS ago," he said, tapping a ledger. "Part of a collection of maritime antiques. The buyer was Mr. Thomas, paid in cash. No address." I headed back to the brownstone, my feet aching and my mind spinning. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was a messy one. We had a dead partner, a missing son, a French key, and a family of Vanes who were all hiding behind their bank accounts. When I walked into the office, the smell of Fritz's roast duck was drifting through the vents, but Wolfe wasn't thinking about dinner. He was staring at the silver key, which he had moved to the center of a clean sheet of white paper. Lon says Marcus Vane had a partner named Silas Thorne who got the short end of the stick in 28, I told him, tossing my hat onto the rack. Thorne is dead, but he had a son. Also the key is French, rare, and was bought by a Mr. Thomas's at auction recently, and if you're interested, Sterling Vane has a temper that could boil water. Wolfe didn't look up. Silas Thorne was a meticulous man, Archie. I met him once, at a horticultural society dinner. He had a passion for hybridizing lilies. He was also a man who kept a meticulous record of his grievances. If the son inherited the father's temperament, he would not merely want the blueprints, he would want the humiliation of the Varney name. He would want Marcus's heirs to tear each other apart before he delivers the final blow. "Is that why he's messing with us?" I asked. "To prove he can get past your defenses?" "No," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He is using me as the instrument of their destruction. He knows that once I am involved, the truth cannot be suppressed. He is not hiding from me, Archie. He is directing me. He wants me to find what is behind the lock that the key opens, because he knows that once I see it, I will have no choice but to expose the Vanes for what they are. It is a very clever, very insolent strategy." "So, what's behind the lock? The truth about the 1928 vintage," Wolfe said, finally looking at me. "Which was not a year of triumph for Marcus Vane, but a year of theft. The blueprints that vanished last week were not the original ones. They were proof of a crime committed 23 years ago. The thief didn't take them to sell them. He took them to bring them here." I stared at him. "You mean the blueprints are in the house? Right now?" "Not the blueprints, Archie. The key does not open a humidor. It opens something much smaller. Something that has been in this room since this morning." I looked around the office, the bookshelves, the globe, the safe, the red leather chair. Everything looked exactly as it always did. But then I saw it. On the small side table near the window, where the Vanes had been sitting, there was a small, ornate wooden box I didn't recognize. It was tucked behind a stack of orchid journals. "I didn't put that there," I said, my hand going to my holster. "Neither did I," Wolfe remarked, his eyes fixed on the box. "It was delivered inside Mrs. Vane's handbag, I suspect, and left behind in the confusion of her departure. She may not even know she was the carrier. Use the key, Archie. Let us see what Mr. Thomas has gifted us for the new year." I stepped over to the table, my heart doing a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I picked up the box. It was heavy, made of dark rosewood. I inserted the silver key into the tiny, intricate lock. It turned with a soft, melodic click, a musical scale just like Salty said. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of blue velvet, wasn't a set of blueprints. It was a single, yellowed photograph of two men standing on a pier, and a handwritten confession signed by Marcus Vane, dated December 31st, 1928. I looked at Wolfe. He didn't look surprised. He just looked grim. "The game has changed, Archie," he said. "We are no longer looking for a thief. We are holding the executioner's axe." I stood there for a long minute, staring down at the yellowed paper while the radiator hissed, in the corner like a snake with a grudge. The confession was written in a cramped, forceful hand that looked like it had been carved into the paper by a man who knew he was signing his soul away but couldn't help himself. It detailed the systematic framing of Silas Thorne, the bribery of 3 city officials, and the deliberate alteration of the Jersey Hub blueprints to ensure Thorne's portion of the land was declared a public hazard. Marcus Vane hadn't just beaten his partner, he had buried him alive under a mountain of perjured evidence. I looked at the photograph. The two men stood on a pier in 1928, smiling as if the world were their oyster, oblivious to the fact that one was about to shuck the other. Wolfe reached out a hand, and I passed him the document. He read it slowly, his lips moving just enough to show he was pronouncing the crimes to himself. When he reached the end, he let out a sigh that seemed to deflate his entire yellow silk waistcoat. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just found a worm in his finest apple. The sanctity of the brownstone had been used to house a confession of a 23-year-old sin, and the fact that it had been smuggled inside a widow's handbag was the kind of theatrical insult that Wolfe usually reserved for his own grand finales. "It's quite thorough," Wolfe remarked, tapping the paper against his palm. Marcus Vane was a man of many talents, but his greatest was his foresight. He wrote this as a form of insurance, I suspect, to be held over the heads of the officials he bribed. But insurance has a way of becoming an inheritance of fire. "So, Eleanor Vane brought it in," I said, leaning against the edge of the desk. "She probably didn't even know it was in her bag. But that means whoever Mr. Thomas's is, he has access to her things. He's close to her. Or he's one of the quintets we had here this morning. If it's Silas Thorne's son, he's playing a very long game. He waited for Marcus to die, waited for the blueprints to be the center of attention, and then used us to verify the kill." "The blueprints," Wolfe muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Where are they, Archie? If this confession exists, the blueprints the family is looking for are not merely plans for a hub. They are physical proof of land scams mentioned here. The missing papers are likely the original unadulterated surveys that Marcus suppressed." I straightened up. "Well, if they aren't in the rosewood box, and they aren't in the humidor at the Vanay estate, where are they?" Sterling said something was missing, and the lawyer backed him up. "But they didn't mention a confession. They probably don't even know it exists." "They don't," Wolfe agreed, "but someone does, and that person has realized that the confession alone is not enough to destroy the Vanay Empire legally. They need ledgers and surveys. They need technical proof to prove fraud. If they have the confession, why haven't they produced the blueprints?" I thought about the subtle trespass mentioned in our preliminary notes. "Maybe they don't have them yet. Maybe they thought the blueprints were in the humidor, but when they broke in, they found out someone else had already moved them. Think about it. Everyone in that room had a reason to want those papers gone. If Eleanor found out what her husband had done, she'd want to protect her position. If Julian wanted to tank the project, he'd want the evidence of fraud to go public, or vanish so he could blackmail the board. But none of them seemed to have the full deck. I went back to the NT door and checked the bolt, then the chain. Everything was solid. I checked the basement again, feeling like a fool, looking for any sign of another entry. Everything was in its place, except for the lingering scent of that bay rum Vane had been wearing yesterday. Then I noticed it. On the small shelf by the stairs where I keep my spare flashlight, there was a gap. A small leather-bound notebook, the one I used to keep track of the wine cellar inventory for Fritz, was gone. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. Taking a confession into the house was one thing, but taking something out was a declaration of war. I went back upstairs and told Wolfe, "The cellar ledger is gone, sir. It's not worth a dime to anyone else, but it was sitting right next to where that silver key was tied." Wolfe's face went from granite to something much harder. He didn't care about the Vanay fortune, but his household records were a matter of divine order. "They took the ledger?" he whispered. "They entered my house, deposited their filth, and stole my property. This is no longer a legacy issue, Archie. It is a matter of a ledger." He leaned forward, his voice cracking like a whip. "Call Saul Panzer. I want him at the Vane estate within the hour. Tell him to watch the back entrance, the one the servants use. And I want Fred Durkin at the lawyer's office. If papers are moving, they are moving tonight. The thief has the confession in our hands, but he has the blueprints somewhere else, and he is looking for a way to tie the two together without getting his own hands dirty." "And what about me?" I asked, grabbing my coat. "You are going back to that limestone fortress. You will tell Sterling Vane that I have the answer to his problem, but that the price has tripled. And Archie, keep your eyes on the widow. A woman who carries a confession in her purse without knowing it is either the world's greatest fool or the world's finest actress. I want to know which one she is before the sun sets in 1951. I nodded, feeling the weight of the silver key in my pocket. The game had stopped being an intellectual puzzle and had become a street fight. Someone had stolen from Nero Wolfe, and in this house that was a capital offense. As I stepped out into the biting wind, I didn't care about the Jersey hub or the Vanay dynasty. I wanted that ledger back, and I wanted to see the look on Mr. Thomas's face when he realized he'd picked the wrong brownstone to rob. The end of the year was coming fast, and the towers of the Kings were starting to look very shaky indeed. By the time I reached the corner of 72nd Street, The sky was a bruised purple, and the wind was whipping off the East River with enough force to discourage even the most dedicated window shoppers. I had already checked in with Saul Panzer from a drugstore phone booth. Saul is the best operative in the business because he looks like a man who has spent his entire life waiting for a bus that never arrives. He blends into the New York masonry like a gargoyle, but he has eyes that can read a license plate from 2 blocks away in a fog. I told him to keep a sharp lookout on the Vane service entrance, and to call the brownstone the second anyone tried to smuggle so much as a sandwich out of the house. The limestone fortress looked even more forbidding in the dark. I didn't go to the front door this time. I used the side gate and found the library window where I'd seen Sterling Vane pacing earlier. The curtains weren't fully drawn, and I could see the silhouette of the boy wonder's son hunched over a desk that looked large enough to serve as a landing strip. He wasn't pacing anymore, he was searching. He was pulling drawers out of the desk with a frantic energy that suggested he was running out of time. I watched for a minute, wondering if he was looking for the blueprints or if he was the one who had already hidden them and was now panicking because the rules of the game had shifted. I went to the front and rang the bell. The butler, a man who seemed to have been carved out of a very old and very stiff piece of oak, let me in without a word. I walked straight into the library before he could announce me. Sterling Vane looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion and fury. He had a smudge of ink on his cheek and his silk tie was loosened. "Goodwin," he spat, slamming a drawer shut. "I told you to get out. My family is grieving and I'm in the middle of a corporate crisis. I don't have time for more of Wolfe's riddles." "Relax, Sterling," I said, tossing my hat onto a chair. "The riddles are over. Mr. Wolfe found what was behind the silver key. It wasn't a blueprint, but it was something your father spent 23 years trying to hide. We have a rosewood box, a confession, and a very clear picture of why Silas Thorne went to prison in 1928. Mr. Wolfe says the price for your father's legacy just went up, but considering what's in that box, I'd say you're getting a bargain." Vane went perfectly still. Blood drained from his face until his skin looked like parchment. He didn't ask what was in the confession, he knew. That told me everything I needed to know about the innocent heirs of the Varney fortune. They knew the foundation of their house was built on a swamp of perjury. "Where is it?" Vane whispered. "In a safe that makes the Federal Reserve look like a piggy bank," I told him. "But that's not why I'm here. Someone stole a ledger from our house today, a small black book of no value to anyone but us. It was a message, Sterling. Someone is telling us they can get to us as easily as they can get to you, and I have a feeling that someone is currently under this roof. You're insane," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We've all been here, except for Vance, who went to his office to handle the executors." "Exactly," I said, "and I have a friend named Fred Durkin sitting outside Vance's office right now. If the lawyer is moving papers, Fred will know, but I'm more interested in your stepmother. Where's Eleanor? She's in her room. She hasn't come down since we returned from your employer's office. She said she had a migraine. A migraine is a great excuse for a lot of things," I remarked, including avoiding questions about how a rosewood box ended up in her handbag. I left him standing there and started a tour of the house. I wasn't being subtle. I wanted whoever was watching to know I was poking into the corners. I found Beatrice in the conservatory staring out at the dark garden. She didn't turn when I entered. "It's starting, isn't it?" she asked, her voice small. "The kicking at the towers. The towers are fine, Beatrice." "It's the people inside who are having a rough night," I said. "Did you know your father kept a rosewood box in his desk? One with a very specific French lock." "My father kept 1,000 secrets," she said, finally turning to face me. "He was a man who believed that if you owned enough of the world, you didn't have to be good. But the world has a way of paying rent. If you have that box, Mr. Goodwin, give it to the papers. End this. Let us all be poor and honest for once." "I don't work for the papers, I work for Nero Wolfe," I reminded her, "and he doesn't like being used as a middleman for a moral crusade." I moved toward the back of the house, toward the servants' quarters and the secondary offices. I was looking for the lock. Every door, every cabinet, every small decorative box I passed got a quick look. I was halfway down the hall when my pocket started to feel heavy. I reached in and felt this eye. Le key. It was a reminder that the answer was physical. It wasn't a feeling or a motive. It was a mechanism. I reached the end of the corridor where a small, unassuming door led to a storage room for the family's maritime archives. I pushed it open. The room was cold and smelled of sea salt and old paper. There, on a shelf filled with logbooks from the 1920s, was a gap. It was the exact size of a large ledger, and sitting on the floor, tucked behind a crate of old sextants, was my black wine cellar notebook. I picked it up, feeling a surge of satisfaction that lasted about 2 seconds. Then I realized the book was open to the back page. Someone had scrawled a note in pencil. "The blueprints are not the prize. Look at the 1928. Page 412. I didn't have the 1928 ledger, but I knew who did. I stepped out of the room and saw a shadow move at the end of the hall. It was fast, quiet, and headed toward the service stairs. I didn't yell, I just started running. I hit the stairs and heard the heavy thud of a door closing below. I burst out into the service alley just in time to see a dark sedan pulling away from the curb. Saul Panzer appeared from behind a dumpster, his face grim. "I got the plate, Archie. But you aren't going to like who was driving." "Who?" I asked, breathing hard in the freezing air. "The lawyer, Vance," Saul said. "But he wasn't alone. He had a passenger in the back who was trying very hard to stay out of the light. I looked like a woman, and she was holding a heavy leather binder like it was a newborn baby." "The 1928 ledger," I muttered. "They're heading for the finish line, Saul. Call the brownstone. Tell Wolfe the circle is closing, and tell him to have the beer ready. I think we're about to have company for the new year." I looked back at the limestone fortress. The lights in the library were still on, but the house felt hollowed out. The SEC rets were moving, and the towers were finally beginning to lean. We had the confession, but the thief had the proof, and the lawyer had the getaway car. It was 1951's final hand, and Nero Wolfe was holding all the aces, even if he was still sitting in his chair 3 miles away. I reached the brownstone just as the city's clocks were preparing to shave the final hours off the year. The wind was howling down 35th Street, carrying the distant, frantic energy of Times Square. But inside the foyer, the air was as still as a tomb. I didn't even take off my coat before I barged into the office. Wolfe was behind his desk, but he wasn't reading. He was leaning back, his eyes closed, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity. The rosewood box was open, and Marcus Vane's confession lay beside a glass of beer that had gone flat. I set my recovered wine ledger on the desk with a definitive thud. "Saul saw them, and I found the ledger," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "Vance is the driver, and he has a passenger who doesn't want to be seen. They have the 1928 ledger, the real one, the one that proves the fraud Marcus admitted to in that confession. It's the 1-2 punch that finishes the Varney family for good. But here's the kicker, they're not fleeing. They're circling back. Saul followed them as far as 42nd Street before they doubled back toward the park. They're waiting for something or someone." Wolfe opened one eye. "They are waiting hours, Archie, and for the audience. Mr. Vance is a creature of the law. He knows that a confession without supporting documents is a weapon without ammunition. Conversely, the ledger without the confession is merely a curiosity. He needs both to be in the same room to negotiate his own salvation. He has spent 30 years keeping the Varney secrets, and he has realized that the only way to survive the collapse of the tower is to be the one who pulls the final lever." "And the woman in the back?" I asked. "Eleanor? Beatrice?" "It does not matter which name she carries," Wolfe remarked, his voice a dry rumble. "She carries the burden of the Varney identity. She is the one who realizes that the truth is no longer a secret, but a commodity. Tell me, Archie, did you see the note in your ledger?" "I saw it. Page 412. What's on it?" "I took the liberty of telephoning the archive of the Port Authority while you were playing tag in the slush," Wolfe said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Page 412 of the 1928 Vane and Thorne ledger does not contain numbers. It contains a map of the original Jersey shoreline before the reclamation project. It shows exactly which parcels of land were stolen from Silas Thorne. It is the smoking gun that makes the Jersey Hub project a criminal enterprise from its inception. If that map is produced, the syndicate won't just buy the hub, they will seize it through litigation, and the Vanes will be left with nothing but their debts." The doorbell rang then, not the rhythmic demand of yesterday, but a sharp, jagged series of bursts. I went to the door with my hand inside my jacket, feeling Marley's cold steel. I looked through the glass. It was Sterling Vane, and he looked like he'd been dragged through a hedge backward. His expensive coat was torn at the shoulder, and his face was smeared with the soot of the city. I opened the door, and he practically fell into the hallway. "They took her," he gasped, clutching at my sleeve. "Vance and a man I didn't recognize. They forced Eleanor into the car. They have the papers. They're coming here, Goodwin. They're coming to finish it." "Who's the man?" I asked, hauling him upright. "He called himself Thomas," Sterling said, his voice trembling, "but he looked like a ghost. He looked like the photograph in that box. He's Thorne's son, isn't he? He's been planning this since his father died." I led him into the office, where Wolfe watched him with the detached interest of a biologist observing a dying insect. "Sit down, Mr. Vane," Wolfe commanded, "and stop stuttering. It is undignified. If Mr. Vance and his associates are coming here, it is because I invited them. I sent a message to the lawyer's office an hour ago, stating that the Rosewood box was open and that the terms of the settlement would be dictated from this room at midnight. I find that when people are desperate, a firm invitation is more effective than a subpoena." "You invited them?" Sterling's voice rose to a shriek. "They have the proof. They'll ruin us." "You were ruined in 1928, sir," Wolfe said coldly. "You have merely been living on the interest of a theft. Now, Archie, the others will be arriving shortly. I want Saul and Fred in the hallway. No one is to leave once the door is closed. And I want the 1928 vintage brought up from the cellar. Not the bottle with the ribbon, a fresh one. If we are to witness the end of an era, we should at least have a decent drink while the world burns." I moved with a purpose I hadn't felt all day. I called Saul and Fred, who were already in position, and then I went down to the cellar. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and aging grapes. I found the bottle Wolfe wanted, but I also saw something else. On the floor, right where the silver key had been, someone had left a single white lily. It was a Silas Thorne signature, a hybrid lily from the man who had been buried by the Vanes. I went back upstairs, the bottle in one hand and the lily in the other. I set the flower on Wolfe's desk. He looked at it for a long moment, then nodded. A touch of the theatrical. Mr. Thorne's son has a sense of timing that I find almost admirable. "Now, Archie, check your watch. The final hour, the year is upon us. The suspects are at the door. The proof is in the car. And the justice of the brownstone is about to be served. Let them in." I walked to the front door as the black sedan pulled up to the curb. The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes now, muffling the sound of the city. Arthur Vance stepped out of the driver's seat, looking greyer than the pavement. Beside him was a tall, thin man with deep-set eyes and a mouth that looked like it hadn't smiled in a generation. Between them was Eleanor Vane, her face a mask of frozen terror. They walked toward the steps like a funeral procession. I opened the door and stood aside. "Welcome to the party," I said, my voice flat. "The big man is waiting, the beer is cold, and the 1928 vintage is breathing. Try not to track too much slush on the rug." Mr. Wolfe has a thing about the rug. As they filed past me into the office, I caught the scent of the man called Thomas. It wasn't bay rum or expensive tobacco. It was the smell of old paper and wood smoke, the smell of a man who had spent his life in the archives, waiting for the moment when the past would finally catch up with the present. I closed the door and turned the bolt. The tower was finally surrounded, and there was nowhere left for the kings to run. The office was illuminated by the soft amber glow of the desk lamps, but the air felt as sharp and cold as a razor blade. Wolfe sat behind his desk, a mountain of yellow silk that seemed to absorb the tension in the room. Before him stood the shattered remnants of a dynasty. Arthur Vance, the lawyer, looked like his skin had turned to wet ash. Beside him, Eleanor Vane sat rigid, her hands trembling so violently she had to clench them into fists in her lap. And then there was the man who called himself Thomas, or more accurately, Thomas Thorne. He stood near the bookshelves, his presence a dark, vertical line against the horizontal weight of the room. He wasn't looking at the Vanes, he was looking at the lily on Wolfe's desk. "It is 11:15 p.m., Wolfe began, his voice a low, rhythmic pulse. "The year is dying, and with it the fiction of the Varney family's integrity. Mr. Vance, you are carrying a leather binder. Please place it on the desk. Archie, if he hesitates, assist him." Vance didn't hesitate. He placed the 1928 ledger on the mahogany surface with the gingerly care of a man handling a live grenade. I stepped forward, flipped the pages to 412, and saw the hand-drawn map. It was beautiful in its precision and horrifying in its implications. It was a robbery plan. "You have been very busy, Mr. Thorne," Wolfe said, inclining his head toward the man in the shadows. "You managed to penetrate this house, which is no small feat. You used Mrs. Vane's ignorance to transport a confession, and you used Mr. Goodwin's own record-keeping to lead us to the final proof. You did not want the blueprints for money, you wanted them on public record. You wanted the Jersey Hub project to be dismantled parcel by parcel, until the name Vane was synonymous with fraud." Thomas Thorne stepped into the light. His eyes were his father's, the eyes of a man who looked for the truth in the soil and the stem. "My father died in a fire in a room that smelled of poverty," Thorne said, his voice surprisingly melodic. "He died because Marcus Vane stole his work and his honor. I didn't come here for a settlement, Mr. Wolfe. I came here to see the tower fall. I knew that if I brought the pieces to you, you would be unable to resist the logic of the collapse." "You were right," Wolfe admitted, his eyes narrowing. "But you were also insolent. You violated my home. You stole a ledger, however brief the theft. You assumed that because your cause was just, your methods would be ignored. You were wrong. Sterling." Vane stood, his face flushed. "He's a thief. He broke into our home. He kidnapped Eleanor. Whatever my father did, it doesn't excuse this blackmail." "Blackmail implies a demand for money, Mr. Vane," Wolfe snapped. "Mr. Thorne has demanded nothing but the truth. You, on the other hand, have spent the last 48 hours trying to find a way to burn the truth before it could be read. And you, Mr. Vance, you have been the architect of the cover-up. You knew about the 1928 confession. You knew Marcus kept it as a weapon against his co-conspirators. When he died, you tried to retrieve it before the executors found it, but Mr. Thorne was faster. He had been watching the house for years." Vance slumped into a chair, his eyes hollow. "I was protecting the firm. If the fraud came out, the entire estate would be liquidated. Thousands depend on Vane Logistics for livelihood. I thought I could manage the transition." "You thought you could manage a lie," Wolfe corrected. "A lie that has grown so large it has become a monument. But monuments are heavy, and their foundations must be sound. Yours was built on the ruin of Silas Thorne." Wolfe took the silver key and held it. The metal caught the light, gleaming like a star. "This key fits a box that contains the heart of the matter, but it also fits the lock of your character. Mr. Thorne, you have achieved your goal. The confession and the ledger are now in the hands of a man who cannot be bribed, intimidated, or charmed. I shall turn these documents over to the district attorney at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The Jersey Hub project will be halted. The land will be returned to the Thorne estate or town as the law dictates. The Vane fortune will be used to pay the fines and the restitutions." Eleanor Vane let out a stifled sob. "We'll be left with nothing." "You will be left with the truth," Wolfe said. "Show. Ing no mercy. It is a lean diet, but a healthy one. As for you, Mr. Thorne, your trespass in my house remains a grievance. However, since you have provided the catalyst for a long-delayed justice, I shall refrain from pressing charges on one condition: you will leave the city by dawn. You have spent your life looking backward. If you remain here, you will be consumed by the same rot that took Marcus Vane. Go and plant your lilies somewhere else." Thorne looked at Wolfe for a long time. The tension in his shoulders seemed to evaporate, replaced by a profound, weary relief. He bowed slightly, a gesture from an older, more courtly world, and turned toward the door. I nodded to Saul and Fred in the hallway, and they let him pass. "And us?" Sterling asked, his voice cracking. "What happens to us now?" "Now," Wolfe said, reaching for his beer, "you will wait in this office until the clock strikes midnight. You will witness the end of your father's year. Then Archie will show the door. I suggest you spend the remaining 40 minutes contemplating the difference between an inheritance and a debt. It is a distinction your father failed to make." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The Vanes sat like statues, trapped in the orbit of Wolfe's desk. I went to the sideboard and poured the 1928 vintage into glasses, but no one reached for them. The wine sat there, dark and rich, a vintage of triumph that had turned to vinegar in the light of the truth. I looked at the clock, 11:45. The year was almost gone. Wolfe drank his beer with slow, deliberate swallows. He looked perfectly at peace, a man who had successfully restored the order of his universe by dismantling someone else's. The brownstone felt sacred again, purged of the intruders and their secrets. We had found the lock, we had used the key, and now we were simply waiting for the gears to finish turning. I sat at my desk and opened my recovered ledger. I started a new page for 1952. I didn't know what the next year would bring, but as I looked at the veins sitting in the shadow of their own collapse, I knew one thing for certain. In this office, the bill always comes due, and Nero Wolfe is the only man in New York who knows how to make change for a soul. The clock on the mantel, a marble and gold affair that usually keeps time with a certain smug precision, ticked through the final minutes of the year like a judge counting down to a sentence. The office was quiet, but it wasn't the comfortable silence of a Tuesday night spent with a book and a bottle of beer. It was a dense, pressurized quiet that made the air feel heavy. Sterling Vane sat with his head in his hands, his expensive suit now just a costume for a man who had lost his stage. Eleanor was staring at the wall, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind the bookshelves, perhaps looking for a version of her life that hadn't been erased by a silver key and a yellowed photograph. Arthur Vance looked older than the furniture, a man who had spent 3 decades building a dam of fine print, only to watch it burst under the weight of a single honest map. Wolfe didn't look at them. He was leaning back in his custom-built chair, his eyes half closed, his great chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic tide. To a stranger he might have looked asleep, but I knew better. He was savoring the restoration of his world. The intruders were still physically present, but their power had evaporated the moment the 1928 ledger hit the mahogany desk. They were no longer the masters of industry, they were merely the leftovers of a feast that had ended 23 years ago. "The weight of ambition, Mr. Vane," Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant murmur that seemed to come from the floorboards themselves, "is a curious thing. It is not the climb that breaks a man, but the things he chooses to carry on his back to ensure he stays at the top. Your father carried Silas Thorne's ruin for a quarter-century. He thought he had buried it in a mahogany humidor and a limestone vault, but he merely provided it with a place to ferment. You have spent your life reaping the benefits of that fermentation. You cannot now complain that the vintage is bitter. Sterling didn't look up. He did it for us. He wanted the name to mean something." "He succeeded," Wolfe remarked, his voice sharpening. "The name Vane now means exactly what it is, a hollow vessel filled with the proceeds of a theft. You speak of legacy as if it were a physical object, a trophy to be polished. It is not. It is a debt that must be settled. If you wish to salvage anything of your own character, you will spend the coming year cooperating with the authorities. You will not hide behind your lawyers or your lobbyists. You will allow the liquidation of the Jersey project to proceed without the obstruction that has characterized your family's history. If you do not, I shall make it my personal mission to ensure the prosecution is as relentless as the crime was cold." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice a thin, reedy ghost of the one she'd used to demand entrance yesterday. "What about our home, the house on 72nd Street? My husband's memory? The house is a museum of a crime, madame," Wolfe said. "As for your husband's memory, it is now in the custody of the public record. I have no interest in your domestic arrangements. My interest ended when that silver key was untied from my wine rack. My house was used as a stage for your family's exposure. I have provided the climax. The denouement is your own to write, provided you have the courage to use the truth as your ink." I checked my watch. It was 11:58. Outside, the muffled sound of a distant siren wailed, a reminder that the rest of New York was still moving, still celebrating, still oblivious to the fact that a shipping empire had just been dismantled in a brownstone on West 35th Street. I stood up and moved toward the window, pulling the heavy curtain back just enough to see the snow falling into the empty street. It was white and clean, covering the 1951 slush and soot, giving the city a temporary, deceptive look of innocence. "Archie," Wolfe said. "Yes, sir? The bottle. It is time." I went to the sideboard and picked up the 1928 vintage I had brought from the cellar. I poured 2 glasses, one for Wolfe and one for myself. I didn't offer any to the Vanes or Vance. They weren't guests, they were evidence. I brought the glass to Wolfe and he took it, holding it up to the light of the desk lamp. The wine was a deep, dark ruby, the color of a secret that had finally been told. The clock began to chime. 12 slow, deliberate strokes that seemed to vibrate through the floor and into the soles of my feet. With each chime, the Varney dynasty moved further into the past. At the 12th stroke, a distant cheer rose from the direction of the harbour, and the year 1952 was officially born. Wolfe took a sip of the wine, closed his eyes for a moment, and then set the glass down. "Excellent," he whispered. "A bit of tannin, but the structure is sound. Much more sound than the year that preceded it." He looked at the 3 people sitting before him. "It is midnight. The year has ended. Your presence in this office is no longer required, and my patience has reached its limit. Archie, show them to the door. Ensure they take their coats. I have no desire to find a vain accessory in my hallway tomorrow morning. I didn't have to be told. Twice, I stood by the door and held it open. Sterling Vane stood up first, moving like a sleepwalker. He didn't look at Wolfe, and he didn't look at me. He walked out into the hallway, followed by Eleanor, who looked as though she had shrunk several inches since she arrived. Arthur Vance was the last. He paused for a second at the door, his eyes lingering on the 1928 ledger sitting on Wolfe's desk. "It could have been handled differently," Vance muttered. "Everything could be handled differently, Mr. Vance," I told him, "but then we wouldn't need detectives or lawyers, would we? Happy New Year. Watch the top step, it's a bit slick." I closed the heavy front door and turned the bolt, then the chain. The click of the lock was the most satisfying sound I'd heard all year. I walked back into the office. The veins were gone, the secrets were documented, and the air was finally starting to clear. Wolfe was already reaching for a book, some thick volume on the hybridization of tropical ferns, as if the last 48 hours had been nothing more than a minor interruption in his reading schedule. "The ledger, Archie," he said, not looking up. "Put it in the safe. And the confession, I want them ready to messenger at 9. Then go to the kitchen. I believe Fritz has prepared a cold lobster and a bottle of remich for our own celebration. We shall eat in silence. I have heard enough human voices to last me until the spring." "Sure thing, Blossoms," I said, gathering the papers. "But you have to admit, it was a hell of a finish. A silver key, a French lock, and a ghost who knows his way around a bodega. You don't get that every December," Wolfe grunted, which is his way of admitting I'm right without giving me the satisfaction of a verbal agreement. He took another sip of the 1928 vintage, his eyes fixed on the page of his book. "Human folly is a perennial, Archie. It doesn't care about the calendar, but at least tonight we have seen it pruned." I put the evidence in the safe, spun the dial, and followed him toward the dining room. The brownstone was quiet, the orchids were sleeping, and for the first time in 3 days, the towers were no longer kicking. It was a new year, and as far as I could tell, it was starting out exactly the way it should, with a full stomach and a closed case. The brownstone dining room was a place where the chaos of the world was strictly forbidden from crossing the threshold. Fritz Brenner had laid out the table with a precision that bordered on the religious, the silver gleaming under the chandelier and the cold lobster arranged on a bed of greens as if it were a centerpiece in a museum. Wolfe sat at the head of the table, his napkin tucked into his collar, his movements slow and deliberate. For the next 40 minutes the only sounds were the soft clink of cutlery and the occasional appreciative grunt from the man across from me. We didn't talk about the veins, we didn't talk about the Thorn confession, and we certainly didn't talk about the police. In Wolfe's hierarchy of needs, a perfect meal ranks significantly higher than the collapse of a shipping MP. When the lobster had vanished and the remich was down to its final golden pour, Wolfe leaned back, his face a mask of profound contentment. The transition from the office to the dining room always seemed to shed a decade of weight from his shoulders. He was no longer the inquisitor, he was the connoisseur. He looked at the empty shell of the year we had just discarded, and then at the fresh, untouched expanse of the one we had just entered. I sat across from him, sipping the last of my wine and wondering if Thomas Thorne was currently on a train heading west, or if he was still standing somewhere in the New York snow watching the towers of his enemies go dark. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice regaining its resonance now that it wasn't competing with a mouthful of shellfish. "The man Thorne, he was a sentimentalist. It was his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. To spend 23 years nurturing a grievance requires a level of emotional commitment that I find both exhausting and impressive. Most men would have let the anger dissipate, or better yet, turned it into a profitable career in a different field. But Thorne chose to live in the shadow of 1928. He got what he wanted, didn't he? I asked, stretching my legs under the table. He saw the veins go down. He used your brain to do the heavy lifting, but he provided the leverage. If he's a sentimentalist, he's pretty effective. He managed to crack the best security system on West 35th Street without even breaking a window. Wolfe's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of the security breach. He did not crack the system, Archie. He exploited the one vulnerability that no lock can guard against, human curiosity. He knew that if he presented me with a puzzle that involved a violation of my own property, I would be compelled to solve it. It was not a physical intrusion so much as a psychological "oh." He did not pick the lock on the door. He picked the lock on my temperament. It was a gamble. Had I been in a different mood, I might have simply called the police and let them stumble through the wreckage of the Vane estate. But he wagered on my arrogance. He won. Well, he's gone now, I said. And the Vanes are currently trying to figure out how to live in a world where they can't buy their way out of a parking ticket. I'd say the balance sheet is even. You got a case, I got a lot of exercise, and the city got a little bit of its waterfront back. Not a bad haul for a Tuesday night. Wolfe shook his head, a minute movement signaling a philosophical disagreement. Justice is not balanced, Archie. It is an equilibrium. We have not added anything to the world. We have merely removed a distortion that has existed for over 2 decades. The Vanes were a symptom of a particular kind of rot, the belief that the passage of time can sanctify a theft. It cannot. A crime at 1 year is a crime at 23. The only difference is the amount of interest the perpetrator has managed to collect. He reached for the bottle and poured the last few drops into his glass. The year 1951 ended with a trespass. Let us hope 1952 begins with a restoration of boundaries. I want the locks on the bodega replaced tomorrow morning, and I want the inventory ledger updated. I do not care if the intruder was a man with a just cause. A house that can be entered by a stranger is a house that is no longer a sanctuary. I'll call the locksmith first thing, I promised. But you know, Blossoms, if you make the place too airtight, you're going to get bored. Half the fun of this job is seeing who's got the nerve to try and get past the front step. If Thorne hadn't left that key, we'd be sitting here talking about the price of orchids and wondering why the phone wasn't ringing. Wolfe looked at me, and for a split second, I saw a glint of something that might have been a smile, though it was gone before I could be sure. I am never bored, Archie. I have my books, my plants, and my cook. The outside world is merely a series of interruptions that I tolerate to maintain the lifestyle required for my orchids. If the phone never rang again, I would consider it a hard-won victory for the forces of peace. Right, I said, standing up and gathering the napkins. And within 3 days you'd be pacing the floor and complaining that the mail was too light. You need the interruptions as much as you need the beer. It's what keeps your gears from rusting. I walked to the window and looked out at the street one last time. The snow was still coming down, a silent white blanket that made the brownstone feel like an island in a vast, cold ocean. The year was brand new, and somewhere out there, another puzzle was already starting to form. Another set of secrets was being whispered into a telephone, and another person was deciding that Nero Wolfe was the only man who could help them, or the only man who could stop them. I turned back to the room. Wolfe was already heading toward the door, his gait heavy and determined. He was going to his room to sleep the sleep of a man who had successfully adjudicated the past and was now ready to ignore the future for at least 8 hours. "Good night, Mr. Wolfe," I said. "And Happy New Year." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. He didn't look back, but his voice was clear. "Good night, Archie. Ensure the chain is on the door. And tell Fritz the lobster was adequate. Not inspired, but adequate." I watched him go, knowing that adequate was the highest praise Fritz was going to get after a night of corporate sabotage and land fraud. I walked through the house, checking the bolts and the windows, making sure the brownstone was sealed TI against the New York night. When I reached the office, I looked at the red leather chair, empty now and waiting for the morning. The 1928 vintage was finished, the silver key was in the safe, and the final case of the year was officially a matter of record. I switched off the lights, letting the shadows reclaim the room, and headed upstairs to get some sleep myself. After all, it was 1952 now, and I had a feeling the locksmith was going to be the least of my problems by the time the sun came up.